très nombreux. En tout cas, l'école d'architecture de Strasbourg est très content de vous accueillir. Il faut prendre le micro. D'accord. Alors, il s'agit de l'agence Territorial Agency, qui est installée à Bâle. Les deux associés s'appellent John Palmesino et Anne-Sophie Ronstock. Lui est suisse, mademoiselle est finlandaise. Cette conférence, elle s'inscrit dans le cycle des conférences qui étaient consacrées à la jeune architecture européenne. Ce qu'il faut savoir, enfin je suis avec le recul de toutes les personnes qui ont présenté leur travail, ce qu'on peut retenir de tout ça, c'est que les démarches qui nous ont été présentées pendant toute l'année sont toujours, ont toujours été très personnelles, très qualifiées, les approches très différentes. Je dirais que c'est un bon espoir de voir autant d'approches différentes, et je pense que c'est surtout une bonne leçon. Être architecte, c'est pouvoir en fait faire des choses très différentes. Et je pense que là, cette conférence, elle va aussi présenter une démarche particulière. Donc l'agence est installée à Bâle. Ça, je l'ai déjà dit. Anne-Sophie est architecte urbaniste. Elle a fait ses études. Attendez, que je retrouve ma petite Copenhague. Copenhague, Helsinki et la Polytechnicum de Zurich. Voilà. Ensuite, John, lui, il a fait ses études à l'école polytechnique de Zurich.
De Milan.
De Milan, pardon. D'accord. Il a dirigé, il a été responsable d'un master recherche sur l'architecture à l'université de Londres. Ensuite, il a travaillé sur un laboratoire de recherche sur la transformation urbaine de la ville du XXe siècle. Il a notamment étudié les villes de Paris, Naples, San Francisco, Saint-Pétersbourg, Hong Kong et les îles Canaries. Ils ont été évidemment publiés dans de nombreuses revues. Ils ont fait de nombreuses conférences dans des lieux prestigieux. Ils ont été exposés à la Triennale de Milan, à la Biennale de Venise. Et donc, ils vont nous présenter leur travail. Donc, je vous laisse la parole. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, everybody. I will speak English this evening, and I will try to do that slowly so that everybody will understand. But that slowly means that I will have also to, at the same time, rush through the 300 and something images that I would like to show you. Can we switch off the light? The invitation was very welcome, especially as it related to architecture in Europe. And we have been dealing over the last almost 15 years of our careers a lot with what is the architecture of Europe. What is Europe, and how can we understand Europe and its transformations? What are its characteristics? How can we intervene in this new political space that we are building? And that's why we are also very pleased to be here in Strasbourg, also because of its engagement with being a crossroads for Europe. It's very interesting that Strasbourg, in spite of its seats of the international institutions of the European Union has little resonance as a city outside of basically outside of its territory. There is a sort of an engagement with the international on one side and a locality, a space of operation that is really particular. And we would like to tonight go through that divide between the international and the local space of operations with a series of probes, like testing grounds of that gap between what is today the notion of the international and what is today the notion of the local. Probably these two notions are outdated. They no longer are capable of containing the engagements, the new spaces that we are generating constantly. So we would like to do this incursion starting from an architectural point of view. And architecture has one main function according to our perspective, and that is to engage in transformations. Architects basically transform the city. We are always involved in manipulating, reorganizing the city. And the role of architecture today is radically changing. This is an image of the beginning of the last century, almost 100 years ago. And it's an architect and engineer standing on top of his building in Rotterdam, looking down at this modern city being constructed. There's a sort of an idea that vision and construction almost coincide. He has complete overview over the construction process, over the transformation process, and he's sort of the master builder. Probably today we have to reorganize both our gaze downwards to what the city is and our position in order to understand how we are building our cities, how we are engaging with the changing territorial transformations. So I start with a very quick incursion, and we start in Milano, and with what Milano degenerated into in the last 20 years. Degenerated is not my opinion. Of course, it's what people in northern Italy think the territory, the city, has become. It has sprawled out over the territory. It has become amorphous, no longer centrally coordinated. There's no master plan. It has become a territory, a terrain of a multitude of individual constructions, single-family houses being extended with a little garage being extended into factory to design furniture, which then everybody who's interested in the furniture and design industries will travel to Milano to see during the furniture fair. The situation that I'm showing you in these aerial images is one of almost chaos, almost irrecognizability of what is built, what is not built, what is the city, what is the countryside, how does it all fit in. So this idea of being faced with a territory, with a city that we almost can no longer recognize as a city, was the moment when that sprung us, and I'm talking in plural here, to establish a new way of looking at the city. And this was done with a rather complex agglomerate of students, architects, photographers, artists, sociologists, formed into what we called the Multiplicity Network, which was established in 1995 by Stefano Boeri and myself in Milano to reorganize the way that we would actually discuss the city. And I will show you quickly a couple of projects that I think might help us to understand better that situation of having at the same time 100 years of modern construction of the city behind us and facing a territory where we don't have the words to describe it. We can only refer to it with words that are borrowed. So I will start with a very large project which looks at the city by the point of view of the users, of how it is used. So the title, of course, is about uncertain states of Europe. We are facing constantly a situation where not only the image is unclear of what we are, but the procedures, the modalities of operation have to be constantly negotiated and reorganized. So there's no clear and stable impression of what is Europe today. Use was part of a large French enterprise at the year 2000, the celebration of the new millennium, to celebrate the new millennium with a series of large exhibitions and shows, one relating to dance, one to theater, one to contemporary photography and so on, and one was dedicated to architecture in the city in Bordeaux at the Centre Arc-en-Rêve. And we were dealing there with a large group of architects, among which a number of students, basically like you, working at Harvard together with Rem Koolhaas on the project on what used to be called the city, or something like that. We were looking at Europe, and we were trying to understand that orange image, where the orange is the density of the population, and it's a rather impressive image because the only figures that you recognize are the higher peaks of the Alps and the Pyrenees, and the coasts. Everything else is almost equally densified. So what we are looking at is a situation where the body of the European territory has been transformed so radically that probably the city is everywhere. Probably we can understand the idea of the city being coextensive to Europe, and Europe being defined by a particular modality of building and transforming the city. As opposed to the Asian city or the North American city or even the South American city, where densities are extremely high but concentrated in the landscape. Think of the downtown Manhattan then with the extents of low rise. Or think of the incredible agglomerations of Hong Kong and Shanghai, basically inserted in a vacuum, very low density surrounding hyperdensity. In Europe, we have a situation which is intermediate. A lot of small, medium-sized towns and a dispersal which is extremely dense. Europe altogether from the Atlantic to the Urals has 330 million inhabitants, exactly the same as the US, but on a third of its surface. So the European territory can really be understood like an incredible situation of urbanity. And what differences can we see if we start comparing it to Asia, to South America? Probably it is the way that Europe changes, which is most revealing for the structure of Europe. And the way that we build our city is usually one of constant reorganization and superposition of different strata. We never start from scratch. We always have to deal with situations that are already inhabited, already densely built. So what we started to do was analyze, like under a microscope, the ways that we change the city. It's either by the insertion of a new complex building or by the substitution of a series of constructions. Sometimes these operations are not coordinated. Very often we tend to transform the city by carving out large compounds and then making very repetitive things within a precinct behind closed doors. Sometimes apparently there's no rule except the pre-existence of a road that transforms the city. Think of the incredible stretch between Strasbourg and Colmar, which is becoming probably a huge shopping center extended over the entire territory. So we started the century with this idea of the city, the idea of the modernist city that would, so to say, this is the Plan Cerdà in Barcelona, gave common rules and common sort of language and common grammar to individual transformations. It was somehow a very successful story. It was somehow the modality of building the city that allowed a very rapid transformation over less than 10 years. Almost the entire Plan Cerdà was filled. And what was more interesting than anything else was the fact that it allowed that structure many mutations, many permutations. The same block, some argue that it's not the block, but it's more the crossroad, which is important, nevertheless. The same block can accommodate a church, a garage, single-family houses, multi-story family houses, apartment blocks, palaces, churches, cathedrals, and so on, and at the same time allow one common language for the entire city. Today, what we have is no longer this idea of a situation where there's a common grammar that allows the organization of differences within one single or spatial organization, but rather we are facing a condition of the city where repetition and coherence is no longer by proximity. So we can recognize types, single-family houses. Very rarely the differences are among them. It's rather like full repetition of single-family houses over wide stretches of territory, and then garages spread out all over, or shopping centers, or the new reconstruction of the city centers from within, from mainly the infrastructural nodes, the railway stations, the subways, and so on. But what we are somehow lacking, or probably what we got rid of, was that idea of the common grammar. Today, we are dealing with a situation that is more and more complex. That map was the map of our case studies. We sent out all our friends and neighbors, almost 90 people networked in Multiplicity, to investigate not what the planners were thinking the city should be, or the architects should thought the city would look like, but actually what is going on. How does it look like? Who's transforming it? Who are the actors of change? Who is engaging with local transformation? Are the young women who are incorporating working spaces into their homes in Spain, reorganizing the shoe industry in Elche, south of Valencia? Or are they the Chinese migrants in Paris, in the 11th arrondissement, going in and reorganizing completely the modernist blocks that were meant to be for the upper middle class of Paris? Reorganizing it so much that now what used to be, what meant to be a large car park has become probably one of the most interesting urban spaces in Europe, this black market of the French at the Dalle Olympiade. Or is it the complete abandonment of public space in a city like Pristina? In 2000, when we were starting to look at these things, Kosovo, of course, was torn apart from the war. Or is it the marginal spaces, the zones at the fringes of the more established cities that mark and characterize today what is Europe? Or is it the resource, the tourist areas? What is Europe today? How can we understand its transformations? So, what we are looking at here is a series of what we call the Bradisismic stirs. Bradisism is like a series of very small tremors, like an earthquake, that suddenly build up a large mass of energy, and the entire city would like shake. It's like when you do this. So you see here we are dealing with a situation where transformation of the city the so-called context of our architectures is shaken and stirred constantly by a multitude of initiatives that are not completely clear. So how can we understand how to intervene into this sea? This is an incredible city. It's Athens, this extension of situations. What happens today is that even the longer-lasting modernist plans have to be completely revised and upturned. This is probably the most bold attempt in Europe to manage large-scale urban transformations, the so-called Randstad in the Netherlands. You see up the black spots as the more urban areas. In the upper corner there's Amsterdam, in the lower there's Rotterdam, and the Randstad was the idea of building a round city with a green heart, so to say that you would manage like a huge landscape protection area surrounded by a growing metropolis. Even this plan is now under a situation that we can no longer keep up with it. And this is where I bring in, let's say, not the first project, but because we already seen that these are clearly not just analysis, but rather interventions in what is the public sphere and what is the organization of the public discourse in architecture. But this is, so to say, an intervention in a different public, in the public of the planners, of the governors. And it's a project that we are engaged in since almost 4 years in the Netherlands. And up there, the green spot is a huge lake, 100 kilometers by 100, very shallow, of water that is silting, that is becoming full of sand. It was once a very large part of the inner sea of the Netherlands. And the 20th century started off with a modernist idea of protecting the Dutch system from the floods of this inner sea, the Zuiderzee, the southern sea, which was the southern tip of the North Sea. Since the 30s, this incredible estuary, which is the largest estuary in the world, is actually part of the delta of the Rhine River, which flows nearby, has been cut off in order to avoid the sea tide provoking storms. So the first construction was the large dike up there. That cut off completely Amsterdam from its sea. Amsterdam, which is this white spot down there, had to reorient itself and towards the west. They dug a large series of canals through the sand dunes in order to have access to the sea. And in the meantime, the idea was to build dikes and then reclaim land from the sea, so-called polders. Polders are very simple constructions. They are constructions that operate on a very clear idea that you build a dike in the middle of the water, and then you pump out the dike from one side, and you live on the bottom of the sea. That's why the entire Netherlands are beneath sea level, because they pump out the water in order to live on the reclaimed land. This was probably the most grandiose infrastructural attempt in the 20th century in Europe to reshape, reorganize literally the geography of our continent through architecture, developed by an architect, developed by an architect and engineer that had such a bold vision to reshape and completely not only the physical geography, but also the institutional geography, the institutional and landscape, reorganizing the economy in order to be able to build this incredible thing. So this is the first plan you see in the lower corner Amsterdam, the big dike cutting it off, and the IJsselmeer, the new name of the Zuiderzee, becomes a lake. Meer is a name of a lake. And the polders. In this map you see 4 polders. Sometimes they became 5. This plan has gone on for 100 years, been transformed completely and reshaped. 5 polders, 3 polders, 6 polders. Let's start in the upper corner. No, let's start in the west corner. Basically, constant reorganization of the plan. Some of it, of course, being built very rapidly. Some other parts taking longer and longer. The Markevard was meant to be the 5th polder, and they started construction. They started building the dikes around it in the 70s. And in 1976, with the oil crisis, everything, so to say, stopped. It's similar situations as we are experiencing today. Big economic crisis, big slowdown, and everything suddenly revolts around you, but it's very difficult to understand exactly which direction to go. The Markevard was probably the last attempt of modernity in Europe. It was the last attempt of building a complete tabula rasa with the new cities of Lelystad, and most famous probably is Almere, which has now almost 1 million inhabitants. Almere was started in 1976, so it's almost 33 years. That is the bottom of the sea when it was still slightly wet, and then you start grazing it and it grows dry. The problem that we are facing is that because the water was never pumped out, the entire system is become so fragile that it requires immediate attention. And that's was the moment when we were brought in to give consultancy to the Ministry for Water of the Netherlands, the Rijkswaterstaat. The series of problems was elucidated in a very frank manner. There is too much water, the dikes are not safe enough. When there's a storm, the water spills over the dikes. The dikes were meant to last 10 years as a construction dike, and then they would become roads among 2 land zones. And the ecological system is declining. But what is really interesting for us is that this is also the ground where one of the largest enterprises for architecture was carried out. This is an image of Cornelis van Eesteren, the modernist Dutch architect, making fieldwork, counting how many cars will pass on a dike in order to understand how large you should build a city. How are we going to plan such an incredible leap forward? So this is, again, Cornelis van Eesteren trying to chart out the plan. These are some of his drawings. What is really interesting and formidable is that you actually recognize the hand, the touch, the sketch of such a master. The issue here is to which profile should a dike have? And it's clearly not an issue of technology. It's an issue of space, of building a space that is so new, but still that you will be able to inhabit. That is not just far removed and nobody would actually want to go and live there, but you manage to bring in people. What happened was that what used to be the sea became land. And so it meant that the entire institutional framework had to be reorganized. New communities, new cities, new provinces in the new land. This has generated a huge fragmentation of the space, not just the physical space, not just the institutional space, but the urban space around us. The problem is that because of climate change, the storms are coming closer and closer to the coast of Europe, and the maxima of the storms are getting closer to this very fragile system. This is what happened in 2005 with the big hurricane that swept away also part of this region. So what happens during these storms is that this very shallow lake, the maximum depth is around 6 meters, a little bit more than this room, 100 kilometers. The entire water is flushed up like a huge surge and doesn't manage to extend beyond where in its natural space that used to be the riverbed, but then destroys and erodes the dike system. So here's an image of Lelystad, another new city, being during a storm, and the water goes away like 200 meters from the coast of the lake because it's pushed up. And we were asked to propose solutions for this problem, but also propose solutions for new ways of inhabiting that space of the sea. And this series of images that show us that that space is become so largely urbanized, so largely constructed and built through separations, demarcations, new roads, exclusive zones, one place to live, one place to shop, one place to work, and so on. That the connection to the water, to the wet soil, is almost lost. So our tasks were very straightforward. You have 1 month to propose us new ways of making the dikes safer during these storms, make the entire ecological system more viable, and propose new ways of inhabitation. About the ecological system, this area used to be the sea, and then it was cut off. So the dynamics of the water stopped. Then it was cut off once again with new dikes that were meant to be dried. That meant that the water didn't manage to circulate. And because of the wind, just a normal breeze, it eroded the bottom of the sea, and all the particles are suspended in the water. And so it's very strange to discuss these things in an architecture school. The birds cannot see the fish because it's too dirty. And since they cannot see the fish, the birds go away. And this is the largest estuary in Europe. And if the birds go away here, they go away also in the south of Europe and in the north of Europe, because this is a stopover on the migration routes. It's actually the largest bird protection zone in Europe. And because it's a zone protection of the European Union, you're not allowed to do anything. So you're in a situation where you have at the same time to improve the ecological system, because it's becoming disgusting, it stinks, and the birds are flying away, but you cannot do anything. So you're almost stuck. This is an image of the dike that was built, and now it's between two bodies of water. It should have been land and water. Another big problem is that the entire basin of the Rhine, all the way up to the Alps, including the Alsace and the Ruhrgebiet, is becoming more and more urbanized. That means that when it rains, the water is flushed directly to the river. It doesn't stay into the ground. That means that the river carries ever more water, and it doesn't evaporate. It goes to the Netherlands. And the Netherlands themselves are becoming more and more urbanized. So the soil they inhabit becomes drier and drier, because you have to pump out the water from that muddy land. And so the soil sinks at the rhythm of 5 centimeters in the last 5 years. It's very extreme. That means that you're becoming lower and lower, the water is becoming higher and higher, and the dike is very dangerous. It's very funny. So this is image of what we were proposing them, and we are proposing them because this is a project that has been going on for now almost 4 years, and it's really taken on by the entire government and very complex democratic systems in Europe, is to put more water. This is our solution for the series of complex problems. The problem of the wind blowing up the water over the dikes can be solved in a very simple way by adding water to the lake and hence not allowing the windstorm to lift the water because the mass of the water will be larger. But of course you cannot put more water without having it overflow, so you have to dig out the bottom of the lake. And we dig out the bottom of the lake, and what we do with the materials, we calculated that we would have so much sand and clay that we could cover the entire Netherlands with 5 centimeters of sand all over. Can be interesting, but it will also make the entire construction industry collapse because you have suddenly the prices of construction materials are too low, so you cannot have a profit, and it's no longer viable to do it. So it's completely difficult problem to solve there. So the situation we proposed was to use the same material and to build islands in front of the dikes in order to protect the existing dikes. It's like being at the kindergarten. You dug out water and you build a little island, but on a massive scale. So the first step would be to dig or dredge the bottom of the lake and make it in a way and give it a shape, literally like architecture. Give it a shape to that dredging that will allow it to become a machinery that will create more than it actually just lowering the bottom of the lake. So these stripes, these canals, these gullies are set at a perpendicular angle to the predominant breeze, to the predominant winds, so that when the water will encounter the dipper pits, it will slow down, the Bernoulli effect. The more water there is, the less velocity the water will have. The suspended particles will drop and clean the water. When there's more wind, when there's a storm, it will come from the west, and there will be less possibility for the water to overspill. Second step is to make very hard cores for dikes above sea level, so that you don't have to, again, in 10, 15 years, go back and reorganize your entire landscape because of the rising sea levels. So you live above the sea level. So we built very strong islands around the lake, and we surround these islands with other materials, with the excess materials, so that we have two sides, a very strong core and a very soft surrounding, which will create very many gradients for biology to develop in a plurality of ways. So we will have possibility of having on the high ground inhabitation or nature or new developments, and then a gradient of mixture between water and land. But what is more interesting than that is that this sand can then itself become dynamic. We can then again tap into the existing energies in the lake and make these sandbanks move in order that when there's a storm, the energy of the storm will not erode the dikes, but will rather reshape the island and reorganize nature. So what we're doing is, so to say, building nature. And the interesting thing is that some of these areas can become almost so wild that they will become completely unexpected landscapes in the European West. The so wild nature is now a concept that is beyond our imagination in Europe. What is another interesting aspect of this ring of islands is that it follows exactly the traces of the planned polder. So it's not inserting, again, something that tries to do a new plan rather than completing the old one. There's been, for 30 years, a problem in the culture of the Netherlands that was, how shall we finish the Markenmeer or the Markewaard? And our insertion, and it was really like starting in 1 month, was just to twist that idea of having to finish something into making it unfinishable, so that you have to constantly engage with the landscape, constantly engage with your environment. You will have to plant trees in a better way, cut them, take care that the situation is constantly being kept in dynamic. This is sort of a quick simulation of how these islands would actually develop. The idea is to start dumping sand and build like a cast, and then in the cores protect them with stones. So the inner part is stable, and all around them you will have situations that constantly moves and reorganizes itself. What this situation allows, it's a very interesting attitude to have two things at the same time. You can have at the same time a very wild landscape and a very stable one, coexisting. And I think this is a very interesting attitude, to do two things at the same time that are apparently at odds. So to be precise and open at the same time, which means that we can start adapting our practice, our architectural engagement with more strategic attempts. It means that precision doesn't have always to be implied and deployed everywhere. We can address precision only when it's needed and allow other things to be more open to other actors to come in. What the ring does is that it generates a series of edge conditions. So each one of the communities, each one of the cities will have a new waterfront that they can engage with and develop a new dynamic with. So the city of Almere can become now a city on the water. The old city of Enkhuizen can reorganize its landscape as it used to be, with sandy banks. Or we can even leave the horizon in front of the city of Hoorn, which gives the name to Cape Horn in the South America, to leave it open, so that the historical perception of the city on the water from the 17th century is not touched. Well, the city of Lelystad can acquire a new development directly on the water. These maps are probably difficult to read at the beginning. They are radar images. That means that everything that is white is high, and everything that is dark is low. There's no distinction between water and land in these cases. The city here is completely black. It's this grayish thing. It means that it's 12 meters beneath sea level. There's one island in the lake, which is the model for the entire development, and we can develop that further. But what is probably for the architects more interesting is that we can actually build a new city on these islands. And the idea, in the lower corner here you see the outstretches of Amsterdam, and that black line is the sluice, the lock that disconnects the water system of Amsterdam from the natural hydraulic system of the former Zuiderzee. In this situation, Almere would be on the opposite corner. We have a condition of one world city developing very rapidly in the last 500 years, and another one very rapidly in the last 30 years, Almere. two completely different urban models. One is the historical city that we know and cherish of Europe, and the other one is suburbia. It's complete modernist city, single-family houses in a row, very little shops. Now there's a big attempt to make it more dense. But we have these two situations that apparently are just about which model of city we should engage with in our future, but we can also understand them as an economical problem. The differences between the two cities is not big enough for them to start competing. All the services are in Amsterdam, and all the people live with a garden in Almere. Almere becomes periphery, a dormitory. So the solution here is to re-engage the Randstad, the circle, with differences, and to channel the new development on the construction of this new city in between, which will be possible if we move the sluice, the lock, from this lower corner to the upper corner, allowing the water system of Amsterdam to be extended into the Markermeer, so that you can actually go by boat from the main station of Amsterdam to the new Markerogen in 5 minutes, and reorient Amsterdam to its space of reference. If we look at all the historical images of Amsterdam, the city is facing the water. But the water is this water. Now it has turned. The city it has, so to say, twisted its development towards Schiphol, towards the airport, because the natural space of reference has been blocked off. It's no longer possible to have visible connection. So with this attempt, we can reorganize the system and reorient the entire organization towards the natural space of reference. Another big area is to a supermarsh. On the two sides of that dike that I showed you running across the water, the pressure is different. On one side the pressure is high and the other one is low. So you have the water basically doing that. If we open the dike in precise position, the entire system can generate a so-called supermarsh, a so-called Ural landscape. So primordial to be unseen. The two parts, the sandy and the so what we have here is a situation where, as architects, we can start engaging with complex urban transformations, complex situations that are surrounding us. But in order to do this, we can probably just stick to the basics of architecture. We can just stick to our tools and engage not in macropolitics, but in precise organization of the physical context. I will now show you quickly a number of other projects that try to adopt a similar attitude on the landscape, on the inhabited landscape of Europe. This is a project for Helsinki, and Sophie's capital. The city of Helsinki, modernist city again, being built with successive rings around a historical core of the city on the water. Because of this modernist attitude, I think you all studied the plan of Helsinki at school, it's becoming more and more disconnected. The suburbs become islands that are completely autonomous. The project here is like a long-term project for 2050, that is in the coming 40 years. What we are experiencing in Finland is a large transformation of lifestyle because of technology, Nokia. Everybody is now moving towards the metropolitan system. So half of the population of Finland is moving to Helsinki. That means that the city has to grow. And it will grow by almost doubling its surfaces, its built surfaces. It used to be an industrial city with small houses, small apartments. It will have to attract a lot of entrepreneurs and young, dynamic urban families, so it has to double in structure. And this is a plan, a strategic plan on how to deal with this sudden growth. And the proposal is to organize, so to say, a reorientation of the city towards its natural space, towards its archipelago on the sea, and towards its hills and forests in the hinterland, avoiding this radiocentric condition. 3 areas. The first one, we need to intensify the waterfront. We need to build as maximum as we can close to the water. We can go and use unused and empty zones around the shipyards, around the abandoned industrial areas, to make the city directly in contact with its archipelago. The second strip, just behind the waterfront, which is now characterized by these modernist, sometimes extraordinarily beautiful enclaves of modernist housing, needs to be more urban. We need to have less exclusion, less disconnections between people. If the entire metropolitan system of Helsinki needs to be competitive, it needs to have as maximum connections as possible. So here's the idea is to build very simple connections between the existing islands, almost like étoiles on a French model that will physically cut through the forest. Sometimes they will be built, some other times they will just be open spaces that will connect the existing areas. And a third attitude that we are proposing for Helsinki is a very simple one. And in order to allow direct all the energies in order to densify the waterfront, we need to lower the possibilities of building in the outskirts where the land is cheaper. In order to do that, we, so to say, restrict possibilities of building even more than what is usual, and allow only to build on the ridges, so that the entire system will follow the slight differences in topographies at the edges of the forest and the fields, so that we build on the traditional Finnish model and allow an overall system to function in a better way. Larger mansions in a city are always needed. They shouldn't be just left as a chance. A second project that tries again to steer the diffused construction of the contemporary city is again in the north. It's again in Finland, in a Lappish resort. It's a very light image. I don't know if you managed to see it. But the idea is that they have found gold 100 years ago in a little stream, and then they started building a cabin log, and people started going there and have fun. It's a very beautiful nature. And in the last 30 years, they developed a resort called Sariselkä, which is actually ghastly. It's terrible. It's just a reproduction of the suburbs. It's a reproduction of the periphery. So you imagine you travel all the way up to the north, and you arrive in a situation, cabin logs dispersed into the countryside, consuming completely the landscape and destroying possibilities of viable ecological system. Last year, they figured out that they are losing too much money, and so they asked the architects to make proposals on how to get out of this crisis. The competition was won by a Finnish architect who proposed a new suburbia. That means, again, the same model. And our proposal was actually turned out to be rather controversial. That was to build on the fringe of the main hill that gives the name to the entire valley. But just at the edge of the forest, just where the forest stops and the barren fields on top start to build. In order to concentrate this effort of reinventing a place in the north on a clear and shared figure, a circle, which then can be built with a plurality of functions and purposes. But the idea is to use density as opposed to dispersal in order to generate possibilities of interaction and possibilities of being together that go beyond that of usual transformations. And we're running quite fast through this territory, and I would like to finish here with a very short conclusion on another initiative that some of us are acquainted, and I think you've seen many projects about this part of Mongolia. And I wanted to stop with this one as a note, again, on the difference between the notion of international and the notion of local, and the Ordos project. And we've just finished a rather large exhibition in Bâle about this project. And what we discovered about this project was almost paradoxical, and that we have, at the same time, a private entrepreneur, Mr. Tsai, taking his area, his space of operation, and reshaping through that a whole notion of collaboration. Rather than just doing what is usually done in China, is completely remolding, reshaping his space, his political space. So imagine, he's a young entrepreneur, he's 45. He became very rich with milk. The Chinese don't manage to digest milk. But milk has become a luxury good in China, even because of emulation. So with that money, he reinvested in real estate and in large farming. The farming aspect is not secondary in the Ordos situation, because the entire landscape, you might have heard it before, is now completely desertified. And the desertification doesn't stem out of just the advancement of nature, but it's completely intertwined with political discussions, political decisions, political movements. That is, after the Cultural Revolution, farms had been collectivized. That meant the size of the farms went slightly smaller than what they used to be, and they were grazed by a higher number of farmers. So the hilly landscapes of Mongolia with the rolling fields and hills became completely overused by the cows and the sheep and the lamb, and that generated a situation of erosion. So the Gobi Desert started advancing. At the same time, this idea of conquering a land like Mongolia from China through an ecological attitude by building has generated a situation where cities become the primary mode of inhabitation. So we are moving away from small villages and farmers basically following their herds to a more settled situation. After the decollectivization, new cities are built. And new cities are built in the entire north and west of China in order to keep people at bay, not to allow them to move to the main cities, Shanghai, Beijing, and so forth. Around 25 million people moved in the last 10 years to the largest cities. And you can imagine the effort of the political system to keep this thing in order. So in all of this situation, China is trying to solidify its outer reaches, to solidify its borders by building cities so that people stay there. And Ordos is very particular because, first of all, it has a Mongolian name. And it's a new name. It's not the old name. It's a new province. It's a new municipality that was established in 2001 with a Mongolian name. And before that, it was not a municipality. It was like a clan system with a Chinese name. It was a congregation of smaller clans. So modernity comes with a name, which is a very old name. And what is really interesting of this place is that that name, of course, resonates in the Mongolian tradition because it's the name of the plateau where Genghis Khan was supposed to be born, and also, I think, they say he died there, or his soul died there. But it's also the name of a brand. It's the name of cashmere. And this place is where they produce 1/3 of cashmere of the world, and so it's a very complex political situation, and it's very interesting to look at this beneath China. Bâle, which was open until the day before yesterday, tried to show again the space between that being local and 100 architects going in and constantly having to negotiate and reorganize their position, not only towards the local, which is almost impossible to grasp, but building a new space of operation by reorganizing new friendships, negotiating their position towards construction, going into parleys about possibilities of undoing their design in face of critiques. Difficult standpoints in order to have some design carried through, and so on. And on top of the architects, there's a whole population of former farmers moving to the city. Some of them are moving to the city in order to become producing small goods, others in order to participate in the construction itself. And what is really interesting is that we end up almost where we started, the idea of the modernist city, Le Corbusier. First you build your garden, and then you will inhabit it. And here we are in a situation similar. In order to keep desert at bay, first you build gardens, you plant trees, you reorganize the terrain, you reshape the ecology, try to pump up the water from the ground using Israeli techniques developed in the last 40 years in the West Bank, very complex situation, in order to give a possibility of having a space of inhabitation in that part of China. What is for us really interesting is then to understand how do you act in such a condition? What is the stance of the architect? What are the most important parts? And how do you organize your work, which in this case was a very fast work. It was meant to be in 100 days. You design a villa in 100 days. Probably the most important thing, I think, for all the architects involved was really the incredible networking, the incredible series of meetings and discussions, and in very long and boring meetings as well, very tiring meetings. It's not always flashy. The idea for us here is really to understand what kind of role does architecture have. Does it have to be only limited to the design phase, where the decision is taken elsewhere, and we give a solution to a problem that has been defined in its major outlines by someone else? So are we limiting our professional attitude to that situation, or are we rather enlarging our field of operation through our strengths, through our possibilities of drawings and organizing transformation of space, and reshape the question, the brief, what we want to build? What is it that we are looking for? Very quick images of the exhibition for those who didn't manage to come. And then, of course, I think I have to show you the design. I think it's part of the ritual here. So we'll show you two, because we are engaged with two design. At the beginning, we were invited independently to participate in this. The first design tries to look at one possible solution for the fact that half of the population of this new district will be workers, and the other half will be temporary visitors, actually the owners, flying in from Beijing and Shanghai. And express this duality of temporary inhabitation of a new city by fragmenting the space as maximum as possible, and then reorganizing the space in order to allow unexpected encounters within the building and around it. So we've literally exploded the program and then tried to recompact it in unexpected ways, so that you will have to meet someone even if you don't want to. So the idea is really to make these stamps, like Chinese stamps in the territory, but at the same time fragment the program in a series of clusters, in a series of... So the idea is that of the enfilade, but slightly offset, slightly off balance. So you have this scattered of 1,000 square meters is too much for anyone to inhabit. It's like, I think, the entire school here for one family with 2 kids. So what we propose is at least to have a family with 2 kids and 2 sets of grandparents, each one with 2 kids, and then friends coming in and meeting everybody and so on. As I said, the unexpected encounters. So the staircase in the house go weird ways. To go from the master bedroom to the kitchen, you will pass through the swimming pool, literally through the swimming pool, and where you will meet the main staircase going up to the upper floors where the families meet and so on. And all of this is then topped with a very large new ground. So we, on one side, carve out the sand, and on the other side, elevate and generate this new ground, which then reflects what is probably a unique vastness of this Mongolian landscape. And we do this by pigmenting the concrete. We build this in fair-faced concrete, and we put 2% of cobalt blue, which is a very precious mineral, into the gray concrete. And this turns it into a very soft dove color, which is the same color as the sky. So it's a little bit of an homage to the Mongolian. The facades are very movimentated. And in between these spaces, we have skylights. That means small courtyards that allow the air to come through the building. So it's a very large building, almost 27 meters in, if you cut through it. And we need air and ventilation, so we open it up like cracks. And so that is, one side you bring things together, but not almost. You just keep them slightly off balance. The second project, the one officially under the name of Anne-Sophie, is a project that tries to deal with this idea of the garden that they are building before the houses. And we're in a very urban situation on the main street of this settlement. There's a huge height difference. between the two sides, and there's a garden facing north. So the entire situation is very harsh. A plot exposed to the wind, to the not very much sunlight from the south, and surrounded by a very big street. So the idea is to really build like a mirror to the garden. So we plant a lot of trees on this slope, and then the building is just next to it, and it's mirroring the garden, so to say, multiplying the little effort that we can have to organize this space. But what this situation does is that it generates like a vertical connection in the house. So the house becomes very narrow, but very high, because we build only on one slice of the plot. And we sort of invert the usual sequence in a house again, and we put the dining room in the lower part of the house, and then the problem is how to connect it to the master room. The garden is then punctuated by very large floating gardens that help to keep up the sand, otherwise the entire thing falls down because it's just sand dunes. So we put retaining walls that form two large floating gardens, that means like terraces, that then connect to this very simple rectangular volume. And that floating garden then starts the series of reflections inside and outside the house, so that when you're inside the dining room, you have the same thing happening in your garden. So again, there's a mirroring of your house and the garden, and it's a very peculiar condition. The spa is in the lower part of the house, in direct contact, hopefully, with the same groundwater in the place. Of course, it will be stinky. I don't think we'll manage that. But conceptually, we are tapping into the water of the groundwater. Then you go up. There's a dining floor with a big kitchen, wine tasting rooms, all the luxury goods that you can imagine in a house. The big entrance floor where you enter from the top with a big garage, a large living room and so on, a big family room upstairs, and the master bedroom on top with a big large terrace. The entire house is just wrapped in a series of railings that are protecting the inner core from the wind. So between the building itself and the facade, there's a series of corridors of small balconies and patios that allow a little bit of freshness between your house and the very harsh outside. The railings are clad in this very cheap Chinese reflecting glass that you find everywhere, but used in a slightly offset way so that it reproduces a sort of multiplication itself. And then inside, it spans vertically. It opens up in all directions. So we will have a very large vertical library cutting through the entire height of the building. So what we will do is actually build a library and collect all the books that they will have to buy and possibly actually send in them. And then diagonally in this cube, the sun will float through the staircase, which will again be clad in glass, so that inside you will see from the bottom of the dining room to the top of the master bedroom, like complete open space opening up and reorganizing the internal space with a series of reflections. As you see, it's very basic and simple interventions, no fancy geometries, no difficult techniques of construction. We cannot negotiate much in that condition. But the minimum that we can do is try to organize slightly different ways for them to build a large house. I would have another half of the world circle to show you, but I think it's getting late, so I think we can ooze it off here. I thank you very much for the invitation. Other questions? Mark and Mayer. Some of them, it's an urban block, so it's like 200 meters by 50. Some of them. Others are smaller, but those rectangulars are 200 meters by 50. So it's quite big.
What's the size of all the marker?
It's 100 kilometers. 100 kilometers.
In the context of competition? Or?
No, it's a direct commission by the ministry.
Okay,
yeah.
That's good.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
A lot of the planners were facing a situation where for 30 years they were trying to push the projects, and then they suddenly realized that in 2 years they were going in pension. And so they thought, rather than just putting everything in the drawers, let's invite someone from outside that will help us think in a completely new way. So what we're doing there is not designing anything, it's rather going into the different offices, opening up all the drawers and see the good solutions that they already have, and then having the people talk to each other. In these buildings, they never talk to each other. They are so separate. So the ecological engineer never talks to the hydraulical engineer, who never talks to the transport engineer, and so on. And what we did was, and I think this is actually probably the basic line of the project, is this idea of integrated planning. We bring architecture at the beginning of the planning, not at the end, and we show them, we can do things, let's do them like this and that. And actually, what happens is that everybody then says it's their plan, because they see parts of their solutions directly there. But the interesting thing is how architecture can be used to integrate these things. Without an architectural vision, there will be nothing. But at the same time, we are, in Europe, very afraid of any plan, because as soon as you have a plan, it's up for negotiation. And so it's ripped apart. But that's, I think, exactly where we have to understand what role to take as architects. Are we just fighting for our drawings, or are we trying to offer something? Are we trying to carve out a different agency, a different possibility of action?
In this process you propose there, how far is it now?
Yep.
By studying or
For 30 years, nobody discussed this area, and now it's part of the main program of the new government to do it. It's called the Randstad Urgent program, the urgent Randstad program, because they need to invest a lot of efforts in order to keep the entire economical system competitive. And so what they will do is to make things there. In order to do those things, they have to change the law. They changed the law last spring, a couple of months ago. So now the law in the Netherlands allows to build outside the ring of the dikes, which was never the case before. So the first result of this plan is the change in the law. The second result is the fact that everybody's doing things. And the third one is the fact that it's urgent. People start understanding that it's urgent, And probably there's a fourth one, and it's the one that we most cherish, and that is that people understand that in order to take a decision, they have to have a long-term vision. It's not just for the elections, because if you don't do things properly, here we're really facing, for instance, effects of climate change in the Netherlands, you can only calculate over spans of at least 50 years. All the plans are now 15 years, so they don't take into consideration the rise of sea levels, because in 15 years it's like 1 centimeter. You don't have to change the city because of 1 centimeter. In 50 years, you will have major changes, up to 70 centimeters, 1 meter difference, because it's not a linear thing. It goes on a different curve. But basically, they changed the law.
So what's for you the difference between the national and the Netherlands? Because you show them the same data.
No, there's only architects. And then there's a lot of employees in the planning department of the cities, but that's a different job.
So there is any difference?
No.
What I like in your proposition is that you and same time more like this paradox work with something maybe say something more.
Yeah, I think.
I actually hate the word density. I think that we always discuss density as if something is as a positive aspect. No, but I think I'm serious about this in the sense that probably our efforts should be about intensity, not about density. And in order to achieve a certain intense urban space or intense architectural space, we need to have differences. We need to be able to be subtle about the differences. So I think cities should be more urban and nature should be more nature, and countryside should be more countryside, and so on and so forth. But in a situation where we are not delimiting and demarcating things. But I see what you mean by this sort of split attitude. And yeah, I think it's probably also connected to the idea of the urbanist and the architect. It's, again, a split attitude in the sense that an architect, by definition, is someone who reduces possibilities. You have to define things very clearly. You are in an exclusive modality of thought. Now, at the beginning, you have many options, and then when you go on designing, you define things. And what you do in the end is you give out clear instruction. It's not that you are at the end saying you can either have 3 houses or 2, or 2 stories or 1. No, you say 1, 2. It's A or B. It's very simple, exclusive modality of thought. But at the same time, we are, as architects, always inclusive in the sense that we are doing one thing, and that is generating a space, creating a space. And this is a very different modality of thought, attitude of thought, that allows other things to come in. So we are sort of schizophrenic situation that I think it's a very useful condition to inhabit at the same time, to be very precise and very open at the same time, to be very exclusive and inclusive, to be engaged with transformations that are not completely within your reach and very limited intervention as an architect. To always have these 2 attitudes in mind, these 2 things. I think that's probably something that students would like to learn.
And also density, the limits of density. Nobody having 100
Thank you very much.